Hello and welcome to Lights On. My name is Conrad, and today we're going to go into our sixth story from Genesis, which is going to be about Joseph. This is one of the longer stories about in Genesis, and so I would really encourage you to read it on your own. I'm going to try to give you a summarized version. And so Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob. Jacob, who we just talked about in the video earlier, son of Isaac, brother of Esau. And so we have Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob. And so the story goes that because Jacob had Joseph at a very old age, he particularly liked Joseph. One day he gets Joseph a colorful robe, and he is very excited to give it to him. Except this robe is basically seen as an indicator that Joseph for sure is the favorite, and then the other 10 brothers, so Joseph is the 11th sibling, but there's 10 brothers and they're all older than him. And all of them simultaneously think that Joseph is the favorite, and so they plot and they scheme against him. When they plot and they scheme against him, at first it was so that they could just flat out eliminate him. They were just going to kill him. Well, one of the brothers ends up having a conscience, and he goes, no, we shouldn't kill him. We should just trade him as a slave. And so that's what they end up doing. They end up throwing him in a well, and then when slave traders are just roaming by, they trade him for some money, and he ends up going to a prison. In this prison, he ends up being able to read someone's dream. He actually read 2 dreams in prison, and then it turns out that 2, 3, 4 years later, the Pharaoh has a dream, and the Pharaoh needs his dream interpreted. And so the 2 guys that had their dreams interpreted in prison are the servants to Pharaoh, and they say, hey, there's this guy in prison. He can probably translate and let you know what your dream means. And so Joseph is given the opportunity to translate the dream for the emperor, and the dream ends up being something that he's going to have. It was about like a fruitful piece of grain and then very unfruitful piece of grain. And Joseph ends up telling him that he's going to have 7 years of surplus, 7 years of excess, 7 years of too much, and that then he's going to be hit with 7 years of drought. And Pharaoh ends up appointing Joseph as the guy to build all the granaries and all the storage things so that Egypt would be very well positioned for the drought. Well, long story short, Egypt prepares himself extremely well for this drought, and basically no one else in the region is very well prepared. And so 2 years into the drought, the same brothers who traded Joseph actually end up in Egypt at basically the feet of Joseph, and they come with a little bit of money and they come begging for food. Joseph recognizes who they are immediately, and through some conversations he actually ends up finding out that they have another younger brother, so this would be a 12th brother. He actually makes it so that the brothers have to go back to visit their father Jacob, and that then they have to bring back the youngest 12th brother to him so that Joseph could hold him as a captive, as a slave. When he makes his proposal, the brothers that betrayed him the most say, my father couldn't handle this, take me instead, please, please, please. If one brother has been taken, this will destroy my father. And Joseph basically is moved. He understands that his brothers are now owning up to the sin that they had committed, he ends up making them food. He actually says Egyptians cannot eat with foreigners, so he doesn't even eat with them. He just hosts this banquet, and then in the end, he's able to forgive his brothers. Long story short, he's able to forgive. So, following the four themes, is there a fear of God in the story? Hardly. Jacob didn't have that much fear of God, considering what he did to his brother Esau. The brothers hardly had faith since they sold their brother for money. And then the third theme is vast rewards or death. Well, the brothers ended up having to go be beggars to the brother that they sold for a few pieces of, whatever currency they had. So they sold him for a little bit of money, and then they ended up having to go be beggars. Then, not only did they have to be beggars, they ended up wanting to sacrifice themselves in place of the youngest brother because the guilt was so heavy. So, jealousy of the 10 brothers on the youngest brother at the time, Joseph was the 11th brother. Their jealousy for the youngest brother once again comes out. So it happened with Cain and Abel, it happened with Jacob and Esau, and now it's happening again with Joseph. The 10 older brothers don't like how much Jacob loves their youngest son, Joseph, so much, and so they sold him. Well, in the end, Joseph actually lets it all go. He forgives his brothers. And the reason for this is because he says that my calling, my reason for existing was so much bigger than any of you 10. I was supposed to save Joseph, Joseph, am supposed to save all of Egypt. And not only do I save Egypt, he ends up saving foreigners such as his father and his 10 brothers, because foreigners come to Egypt knowing full well that there's food there and that they have a surplus of food. And so the story of Joseph, it takes an odd turn, because he ends up being renamed with an Egyptian name, and he ends up giving up huge plots of lands to his 10 brothers, and it more or less ends happily ever after. But this is one of those stories that's, if you actually have faith in God, then you start to understand how no matter what position you get put in, you can be at the bottom of a prison, but if your destiny is to save the entire Egyptian and surrounding world because of your knowledge and your ability to interpret dreams, and it doesn't really matter what your brothers do to you, because God's going to pull you out of there anyway. His faith was so great that even when he was in prison for 4 years, even when he had the opportunity to revenge on his brothers, which he very easily could have just killed them if he really wanted to, but he didn't, because his faith was so great. So this is the third story of jealous brothers. We have Cain and Abel, and then we have Jacob and Esau, and now Joseph gets turned on by his brothers because they're jealous that their father loved Joseph so much. And so this is just more reaffirmation that jealousy is not the answer, and that if you are a jealous person, then you will basically be cut from the vine in one way or another. And when you're cut from the vine, it's never how you want to be cut. It's how God wants to cut you. And so there's a saying in, either you humble yourself or God humbles you. Yeah, when you're jealous, you don't really get a choice in how how to humble yourself. No, God just directly humbles you. So he made his brothers go beg the older brothers ended up having to beg the youngest brother that they discarded basically for a piece of trash. And so jealousy is never the answer. It's in all three stories, all three people, it ends up going very poorly. And so clearly jealousy, especially amongst brothers, is is probably the worst thing that could possibly happen, but it's in Genesis over and over and over again. Thank you for watching Lights Out.